Hi everyone, here we are for lecture number 6. Our focus of today's lecture is going to be the long-term and short-term causes of World War I. So we're going to look at why the First World War comes about and some of the reasons or factors leading into it. Okay, just a reminder, I'm going to give you a list of terms before I start talking. The list will be kind of like I put in our face-to-face class on the board. Now, you're also expected to write two one-paragraph responses to the terms. I want you to consider the terms in relationship to the overall theme of the lecture, of this lecture. Okay, so two one-paragraph responses, and then also a one-paragraph response to one of your classmates' posts. Okay, here are our terms. First term would be Anglo-German antagonism. That's spelled A-N-G-L-O, German antagonism. Also, propaganda. Second term is propaganda. Third term, demonization. D-E-M-O-N-I-Z-A-T-I-O-N, demonization. Next term, arrogant attitudes. Another term is going to be conscription. An additional term will be arms race. Next term, eugenics. That's spelled E-U-G-E-N-I-C-S. An additional term would be triple alliance. Next term, triple entente. E-N-T-E-N-T-E. Next term, dreadnoughts. This interesting word is spelled D-R-E-A-D-N-A-U-G-H-T. These terms will also be in the discussion post. Okay. Well, so considering the let's first consider the long-term causes of World War I. So these are gradual societal changes that occur over a period of, it can be up to 40, 50 years. So you always have to ask, what were the factors that led into a major event? So a major event like the French Revolution, a major event like the Crimean War, a major event like the First World War. So these don't just happen overnight. There's factors that lead into it. Or just think of society. Okay, so let's look at for example, compare the woman of 1960, the typical woman of 1960, with the typical woman of today. Do they really have a whole lot in common? Is the roles of women in 1960 going to be much like the roles of women today? And did these changes come about immediately, or were they slow, gradual societal changes? Well, I think in comparing the woman of 1960, she's going to be almost unrecognizable from the woman of today. For example, how many of your mothers at home made a typical meal of pancakes, eggs, bacon, sausage, ham steaks, homemade biscuits, and freshly squeezed orange juice for their family every morning, while being all made up before 6 o'clock and having an apron on and wearing white pearls? Does that sound much like the woman of today? Now, today, the woman is working alongside her children. She often has to leave the house earlier than the children of the house. So her idea of giving the family breakfast is opening a box of Pop-Tarts and saying, eat it up yourself. Okay, so the gradual societal changes are going to lead into this difference. Think of the women's movement of the late 1960s. We have Helen Reddy saying, I am woman, hear me roar. So a whole gradual societal changes. Well, the same thing now with the long-term causes of World War I. Okay, so one that we've talked about already is the Anglo-German antagonism. We talked about that in a past lecture. Now, do you remember what the Anglo-German antagonism was about? The Anglo-German antagonism was basically the conflict over the colonies of Africa, where England got all the land and Germany got mad that England got land that the Germans felt should rightfully belong to them, and this growing resentment. So you're going to notice Germany and England are the major actors or the major players on the two sides in World War I. So this growing resentment is occurring over a long period of time. It just doesn't happen overnight. Okay, so that's one of the long-term causes. Another long-term cause is there's going to be conscription in all the major European nations, with the exception of Britain. So by 1890, conscription refers to the draft, the fact that people at this time, men, are forced to join the army. Well, think of the political capital you're losing in being forced someone to join the army. So you're only going to force people to join the army if you think you're really going to need the army. Okay, so the fact that governments are using up this political capital in forcing people to join the army already tells us basically how important that it was to them at the time. It indicates the fact that they expected a war to occur. It wasn't like a maybe, it was sort of imminent, not if the war would occur, but when would a war occur. So this is 25 years before World War I. World War I is going to start in 1914. Okay, so conscription, another term. Okay, now there's also going to be the arms race. Okay, the arms race. When we think of the arms race, probably the one we think of most, and one that you'll cover in a lot of detail in your U.S. history course here at Del Val, is going to be the arms race that we see after World War II. So the United States against the Soviet Union. So they were, competing with each other. But long before they were competing, there's going to be an arms race between the British and the Germans. Okay, so the idea that if one country is spending money on arms, it's the idea that the other country has to spend an amount on arms. So you're going to see that by 1890, 25 years before the war started, all of Europe is basically spending about 10% of their income already on the military. Now, would you say that's a lot or not really that much? Well, if you're like me, it's a little hard to think of billions of dollars. It's just, a big number. But let's think of, all right, let's say like a regular family. Let's say average family income, $50,000. Okay, so what would 10% of that be? It would be $5,000. Would you say that's a lot to spend every year on protecting your family? So either, a really good security system or an attack dog, and an attack dog would be just one that you can't play with, all it does is bite, or new sets of guns every year. Well, I think it depends where you live. If you live in a dangerous area, that doesn't seem like too much. But what if you live in a fairly safe place like Chalfont or the Del Val campus? That would be kind of a lot of money to spend every year because what else could you do with that 10% of your income? Well, for $5,000, you could take a pretty nice trip to Disney World with your family every year. All right. Now, is this going to be an easy sell to your kids? If you say, hey, kids, sorry, we can't go to Disney World this year because we're spending all our money with this protection. and we're going to buy an attack dog, but you can't pet it because all it does is bite. Not going to be a real easy sell. So how are we going to get people to be willing to make the sacrifice for the protection of the family, or in a larger scale, the war effort? Well, one thing is you're going to use what's called, next term, propaganda. Okay, now where do we think of propaganda? We think of it a lot in politics. You're always going to see it, used a lot in politics. One politician says what they're doing is so great and why it's perfect, and they have all the answers to everything, and then they're going to completely ignore any inconsistencies in their argument. Well, the opposing side is going to do the same exact thing. So there are messages, there's advertising, there's, kind of showing one side of the equation. It would be like, if you say, wait a minute, everybody wants low taxes. But, if the government doesn't take in very much money and it's low taxes, you're not going to get much services. Well, if you don't have much money, you need a lot of government services. But what if you have a lot of money? Do you really need government services? No. So you would probably rather they have lower taxes and, less service. Because, who's going to be paying the taxes? The ones paying the taxes are going to be ones that have more. If someone's real poor, they're not going to be paying any taxes at all, and they're just going to be getting government services. Okay, so propaganda basically is showing one side of the equation, just showing why their side is right. All right, so you're going to use propaganda as a way of saying why one way of doing things beats another way. So if you want to, do that to get people to be willing to sacrifice for the war, you could say, it would be almost like, what would you do for the family to get them to be willing to make the sacrifices not to go to Disney World? You could say, kids, you're right. We should go to Disney World. We deserve it. We want to do it. It's what everyone would like to do. We're not going to bother with the protection, but hope you haven't gotten too fond of Daddy, because in the neighborhood we live in, it's, like a 50-50 chance he'll even make it from the car back to the house. But no, we're going to do what you want. Okay, so you're scaring the kid and you're making the threat look worse than it really is. And that's going to be our next term, which is called demonization. Okay, so our next term, demonization, well, that basically means the idea of making your enemy look like the devil, making them look much worse than they really are, exaggerating or emphasizing their negative characteristics to make them look demonic and, even worse than they really are. So think, for example, in World War I. Here's how demonization is going to go. Okay, the English are going to make all the Germans look like Attila the Hun. They're going to make them look like inhuman monsters ready to kill off everybody just for the fun of it. They're going to make them against Christianity and, basically say if the Germans win, if we don't put a whole lot of money into protecting ourselves from these inhuman monsters, we're not going to survive as a species. Now, that's once again going to be demonization. You're making them look much worse than they really are. And then the Germans are going to do the same thing about the British. So that's going to be one of the long-term causes, demonization. All right, another long-term cause. You're going to also see the use of eugenics. All right, now eugenics usually means selective breeding. And that in itself is not a bad thing. For example, you're going to want selective breeding to have certain characteristics bred into the animal. So, you want a racing horse. So you want to make sure it's fast and lean and strong and, characteristics that you want in a racing animal, which is going to be a bit different than what you would want for, a plow horse or something. Or, you want to make sure, you have dog racing. You want to make sure your dog is more like a greyhound rather than a basset hound. Nobody wants to look at short, fat little dogs and stubby legs running around the track. So, where are you going to get these characteristics? You breed it into the animal. But here's what eugenics means in this context. So our next term, eugenics, It's the idea that all of Europe basically developed, starting around the 1880s or so, but intensifying as you got closer to the World War I era. The idea that basically the you wanted the people to be uh, a certain way. So they felt basically the quality of Europe had become diminished. They felt there's too much inbreeding among different groups in Europe. So instead of England remaining purely Anglo-Saxon and the French remaining just descendants of the Frankish kingdom and the Germans being descendants of the Huns, there's too much mixing of different groups. And at the same time, there's going to be a lot of pseudoscience created trying to show that, for example, Jews and blacks were intellectually and physically inferior, and that they're mixing with the, good, decent, pure races of Europe, and they're basically ruining everything. Okay, so this became seen as a big problem in Europe, and they believed that the only way you could really solve this would be a war. Now, how would a war work? A war would work because that way, you think of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest that we talked about before. What's going to happen? The weakest, mentally or physically, they're going to be the first ones to die in a war. They're not as smart, they're not as fast, they're not as creative, and they would die off. So what would you have left? The best people, the strongest, the smartest people, and they're going to be the ones that would be left. And then you would have good, decent people left in Europe instead of all this, as they're calling them, the mongrel races. Well, when we think about this is pretty scary. This is pretty scary stuff. It actually sounds a lot more like World War II than it does World War I. But here's the thing. World War II is really a continuation of the unsolved problems of World War I. So there was the same kind of eugenics in Europe on the eve of World War I. Okay, now another thing we're going to see, and this we could also call another term, arrogant attitudes. Okay, there's going to be a lot of arrogant attitudes among all the major players of the European theater. Each of the countries are going to feel they're very prepared for a war. A war would be a good thing because they could gain control of not only all of Europe, but all of the colonies as well. So everyone's kind of expecting a war to occur. It's more a question not if it would occur, but when would it occur, and then how long would it last? Well, they're saying it could last 6 weeks at the long set, that at most maybe 10 weeks. Looking back on it, of course, it looks ridiculous. It's going to go on for 4 years. But at the time, they each had this arrogant attitude that they could win easily. And, why did they have all this arrogance? Well, they're looking at how much more advanced they were technologically in the last 20 years than the way they were before. They're looking at, wait a minute, by 1890, they have all these new advanced weapons that they didn't have in 1870. They're not paying that much attention to the fact that all the other countries also have some very advanced weapons. So actually, let's discuss some of these weapons of the World War I era. All right, well, when we think of World War I, the first thing that probably comes to mind is tanks. Okay, the first tank came about in the year 1915. And they were actually a little disappointed with the way that the tanks performed. Now, where is World War I going to be performed? Well, it's going to be it's going to be engaged in the trenches. And it's going to be in many places at the same time. So unlike all other wars, other wars we think of maybe like a chessboard or a checkerboard, one side against the other. Now it's being fought in many different arenas at the same time. So it's going to be fought in the skies. There's going to be the invention of airplanes, used in World War I. There's also going to be chemical warfare, so the use of mustard gas. Another invention is also going to be fought in the seas. Okay, there's going to be what are called, and this is another term, the dreadnoughts. Okay, a dreadnought is a World War I era battlefield. And this World War I era battlefield is going to actually be fought. Now, what does a dreadnought look like? Okay, the first dreadnought came about in the year 1906. Dreadnoughts, think of a ship the size of the Titanic. They're going to be made up of, a tremendously large ship. The ship is going to be made of reinforced it's going to actually have an iron hull and have reinforced concrete on top of the iron hull. They're going to have 6 guns on each side. Each of these guns can shoot a shell about a foot in diameter. So, it can shoot a cannonball, think of it, at about 850 feet, and it can go for about 10 miles. It can certainly cause a lot of destruction with one of those babies. And actually, the dreadnoughts are, they're going to get the nickname of the monsters of the sea, these World War I era battleships. And basically, they're indestructible. The only thing that can destroy a dreadnought is either a shot from another dreadnought, or, and this is another going to be a World War I era weapon, the U-boat. Okay, U-boat is actually short for the German name, the Unter dem See-boot, under the sea boat. And these Unter dem See-boats, these submarines, they're going to become in wide usage during the World War I era. Now, they're actually going to be invented earlier. I was actually found it kind of fascinating. I was in Charleston, South Carolina, and they have there at the Charleston Museum a submarine called the Hunley. So it was actually used in the end of the Civil War. But that was a rare thing. Where it became really popular was in the World War I era. Okay, so we begin to see that. We see the so it's being fought in the air, it's being fought under the sea, it's being fought in land in many different places, it's being fought in the trenches. So basically all over the place it's being fought on a much wider scale than anything we've ever seen before it. So they're all looking at the fact that, hey, we have all these great advanced weapons, we can easily conquer them, and the stakes are high. We're going to get not only all of Europe under our control, but all the colonies that Europe had controlled as well. So if it had worked that way, think of what a really good deal that would be. You fight for 6 weeks and you gain control of almost the world. But of course, it didn't end up that way. And then when they see that it's not really going in the direction that they thought, that it's not going to be an easy victory, then they're really going to start using the propaganda to bolster up the war effort, and then also the demonization of the enemies to get people to be willing to make this sacrifice by making the horrible event seem even worse than the way it really was. Now, you're going to see by, okay, so those are all the long-term causes. Now, so these gradual societal changes that are leading up into the war, so these are going to happen with any major event like a war. But you always have to ask, why did it occur exactly when it did? Why wasn't it a month earlier? Why wasn't it 2 weeks later? So there's going to be certain specific events that are going to lead directly into the war. Now, you're going to see, for example, as one of the right on the eve of World War I in 1910, and remember the war is going to start in 1914, Europe is already divided into 2 sides. These sides are going to be on the opposing sides, and they're going to be these 2 groups. Okay, one group is called the Triple Alliance. Okay, the Triple Alliance, another term, so Triple Alliance is made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on one side, And then on the opposing side is going to be, this is the next term, the triple entente. Think of that with that nice nasally French accent, entente. And so you already know France is going to be one of them. Well, in addition to France, we're going to have England and Russia. So the entente is going to be England, France, and Russia. Okay, so we have these two different groups on opposing sides. They made this deal 4 years prior to the start of World War I. And then, it's this idea, this alliance system is based on the idea that if you attack any one member of the group, it would be the same as attacking any other member of the group. So, for example, think of you and two of your friends are going to the Commons to eat at the pub. And then somebody attacks one of your friend on the left side and you're in the middle. Are you going to just ignore it and say, well, I'm hungry? Well, I guess it depends how hungry you are, but usually no. If they attack your friend, it'd be the same as attacking you, particularly if you're a good friend. So they made up this, previous agreement. So if you attack any one member, it's the same as attacking any other member. Okay, so these are some of the causes leading into World War I.